All right, learners, get ready, because today we're going deep on something really fascinating. Japan's post-war economic miracle.
Ah, the one where they went from utter devastation to global economic superpower, right?
Exactly. But we're going to look at it through a different lens this time, thanks to a YouTube documentary y'all sent over, Power of the Banks.
Yeah, I saw that one. Japanese banking system? Something like that, right?
Yep. Best documentary. That's the one. And let me tell you, it throws some serious shade on the whole free market success story thing.
Oh, yeah. It really challenges some of the usual assumptions about how that all happened.
So picture this. 1945, Japan, bombed out cities, economy in ruins.
Starting from scratch, basically.
But then, boom, in a few decades, they're cranking out cars and electronics, taking over the world.
The Japanese economic miracle, everyone wants to know the secret sauce, right?
Right. And we usually hear it's all about hard work and innovation, but this documentary, it suggests there might be more to the story.
They suggest another force at play, something called window guidance.
Window guidance. Okay, now I'm intrigued. Break that down for us.
Well, imagine this. The Bank of Japan basically dictating to every single bank exactly how much they could lend out.
Like setting limits.
Not just limits, they'd tell them exactly which industries to lend to, even down to specific companies. It was super detailed.
No way. So instead of a free market, it was more like, what, a planned economy?
That's what the doc argues. Pretty wild, right? They even showed documents from back then listing individual borrowers by name.
Whoa, talk about control. But I guess it worked, right? Japan's economy did boom.
It did. The doc highlights just how fast and how big their recovery was. Like in 1959, their economy grew something like 17.7%.
17.7%. That's insane.
Almost hard to wrap your head around, but even during this boom time, the documentary hints that there were already some red flags, like potential problems brewing beneath the surface.
Oh, like what?
Well, since the Bank of Japan was essentially picking winners and losers, it led to this crazy competitive environment.
So too many companies vying for the same slice of the pie.
Exactly. They called it excess competition. Like, imagine everyone's forced to fight over scraps in the same tiny sandbox. Things get brutal.
Yikes. So companies were practically driven to destroy each other just to survive.
Pretty much. And the doc suggests that this cutthroat atmosphere, this pressure cooker environment, might have actually laid the groundwork for the crazy asset bubble that would hit Japan in the 80s.
Ah, the bubble. Now things are getting interesting. So how did Japan go from this tightly controlled system to like insane real estate prices and a stock market frenzy?
Well, things started shifting in the 80s. Japan started deregulating its economy, moving away from this window guidance and towards a more, Western free market model.
So on the surface, it sounds like a natural progression, right? Moving away from wartime economic controls.
Yeah, that's how it was presented. But the documentary raises some eyebrows here.
Oh, how so?
They suggest that the groups pushing for this deregulation, some of them might have had ulterior motives.
Hold on, are we going down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole?
Not necessarily, but the doc points out that some of these groups had strong ties to foreign interests.
Interesting. So deregulation opened the door, but what actually ignited the bubble? What was the spark?
Well, according to the doc, the Bank of Japan might have played a bigger role than they let on.
You mean even as they were loosening control, they were still pulling strings behind the scenes?
That's what they claim. And they even have interviews with bankers who admit the Bank of Japan was basically pushing them to lend more than they felt comfortable with.
Like, just keep lending, lend, no matter what.
Exactly. It's like they were pouring fuel on the fire.
So deregulation plus this loose monetary policy, that's what created the perfect storm.
Exactly. And the results were wild. Real estate prices went through the roof.
Like, how crazy are we talking?
Well, the documentary mentions that at the peak of the bubble, the Imperial Palace Garden in Tokyo was valued as being worth more than the entire state of California.
Hold up, the Imperial Palace Garden, more valuable than all of California.
That's insane. Yeah, it was a wild time. And the stock market, it wasn't any calmer over there. Stock prices more than tripled between 1985 and 1989.
So everyone was partying, riding the wave, but we all know what happens with bubbles, right? They eventually pop.
And pop this one did, so who gets blamed for bursting Japan's bubble?
Who done it? Spill the tea.
The documentary points the finger right back at the Bank of Japan, this time under the leadership of Yasushi Mano. In 1990, he slams on the brakes, restricts real estate lending, and later gets rid of window guidance altogether.
Wow, so the same institution that arguably fueled the bubble also pots it? That's interesting.
It is, and it gets even wilder. Remember how Miyano was the one who burst the bubble?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? He was actually the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan during the bubble years.
Wait, so he was the guy arguably responsible for pumping all that money in the economy in the first place?
You got it. So the documentary suggests that this wasn't just some random economic boom and bust. It was a deliberate strategy by the Bank of Japan.
Okay, my mind is officially blown, so what happened after the bubble popped? Did Japan bounce back?
Not quite. What followed was a period of economic stagnation. They called it the lost decades.
The lost decades. Yikes, that sounds rough.
It was. The stock market crashed, land prices plummeted, Japan went into deflation, people lost their jobs, businesses went bankrupt. It was a rough time for a lot of people.
And the documentary suggests that the Bank of Japan could have prevented this. They could have softened the blow.
That's what they argue. They say the Bank of Japan had the tools to end the recession pretty quickly by, pumping money into the economy, stimulating growth.
But they didn't. Why not?
This is where the documentary gets really controversial. They claim the Bank of Japan chose not to act because they believed the pain of the recession was necessary to push through structural changes they wanted.
So they were willing to let people suffer just to get their way.
That's the argument, and it's a pretty disturbing one.
It is. So they're saying this wasn't just an economic downturn. It was almost like, a controlled demolition?
That's the implication, and they even go on to connect this whole Japan saga to other financial crises around the world, suggesting that this kind of manipulation by central banks might be more common than we realize.
Okay, we are definitely going down a rabbit hole here, but this is fascinating. Before we dive into those other crises, I need to know more about this idea of the Bank of Japan intentionally prolonging the recession. What evidence do they have to back up such a wild claim?
Well, they point to a bunch of things. First, they highlight all the calls for economic stimulus from politicians and economists during those lost decades.
Like people were saying, hey, do something.
Right, and the Bank of Japan basically ignored them or even pushed back. They even reduced the amount of money in circulation at times, which probably made the recession worse.
So they were actively making things harder.
That's what it looks like. And they also quote some Bank of Japan officials who straight up said they believed the recession was necessary for structural change. Like they thought stimulating the economy would just delay the inevitable.
So their thinking was, let's just rip off the Band-Aid, even if it hurts.
That's one way to put it, and it raises some serious questions about the role of central banks and how much power they really have.
It does. It makes you wonder who they're really working for.
Right. It challenges the whole idea of them being neutral actors.
This is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
All right, let's shift gears for a sec and look at those other crises the documentary mentions. What connections do they make between Japan and what happened in other parts of the world?
Well, they bring up the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s as a particularly striking example.
Right, the one that hit Thailand and South Korea and Indonesia pretty hard. What was the deal with that one again?
Basically, those countries saw their currencies collapse and their economies tank. It was a mess.
And the doc is suggesting that this crisis was somehow, manufactured, orchestrated.
They don't use those exact words, but they do argue that the IMF's response to the crisis was eerily similar to what happened in Japan.
Yeah, okay, I'm listening. What are the parallels?
Well, in the years leading up to the crisis, the IMF and other international organizations were pushing these Asian economies to deregulate, to open up to foreign capital. Sound familiar?
It does. It's like the Japan situation all over again.
Right. And just like in Japan, this deregulation created a bubble. Central banks in those countries, with the IMF's blessing, kept their currencies pegged to the US dollar.
So borrowing in US dollars became super cheap.
Exactly, which led to a flood of foreign money pouring in, fueling the bubble even more.
Classic recipe for disaster: cheap money, inflated prices, boom, and then
Bust, exactly. And when speculators started betting against these currencies, the central banks tried to hold on, but eventually they ran out of reserves.
so they had to go crawling to the IMF for help.
Yep, and that's when things get interesting, according to the documentary.
All right, spill the tea. What happened?
Well, instead of giving those countries a bailout that would have stabilized things, the IMF used the crisis as an opportunity to force through some harsh austerity measures.
Wait, hold on. Isn't that exactly what the Bank of Japan supposedly did?
It's like they were using the same playbook. The IMF demanded these countries raise interest rates, cut government spending, the whole 9 yards.
But wouldn't that just make the recession worse?
Yeah.
Like pouring water on a drowning man.
That's exactly what happened. According to the doc, they say the IMF's actions actually made things worse. More unemployment, more poverty, more unrest.
So if this is all part of a plan, what was the IMF's real goal?
The documentary argues they weren't really trying to help these countries recover. They were using the crisis as leverage to impose a specific economic model, one that favored foreign investors and big corporations.
At the expense of the everyday people, of course.
Sadly, yeah, it's this pattern of manipulation and double standards that makes you wonder if the system is rigged against the average
It
person.
makes you question everything, that's for sure. But before we spiral into existential dread, maybe we should take a breather.
Yeah, good idea. We've covered a lot of ground already.
We've definitely blown our listeners' minds by now.
And we've only scratched the surface.
Well, true. We still have to unpack the Eurozone crisis and talk about potential alternatives to this
A
system.
lot more to dig into.
So to our listener, take a moment to process all of this. We'll be back in part 2 to delve even deeper.
See you soon.
Welcome back, learners. Whew. I don't know about you, but my head's still spinning from that last part.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, this whole idea of central banks maybe intentionally shaping economies.
And not always for the good of the average person, right?
Exactly. It really makes you think about how the world actually works behind the scenes.
So, taking a step back from all the details, what's the big takeaway here? If these central banks really have this much power, and they're willing to use it to, like, engineer booms and busts, who benefits from that?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? The documentary seems to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the whole system is tilted in favor of certain players.
The elite, the big guys.
Yeah, and at the expense of the rest of us, in the case of Japan, they argue that the Bank of Japan pushing for those structural changes, even if it meant those lost decades, ultimately benefited big corporations.
The ones who could afford to buy up assets when prices were low.
Exactly, like the old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right, and then in the Asian financial crisis, it's like the IMF used that crisis to force those countries to open up their markets even more, creating opportunities for, multinational companies and Western banks to come in and profit.
Yeah, it's a cynical view, but it's hard to ignore the evidence they present.
It's definitely disheartening, but what can we do about it? Are we just stuck in this system, powerless to change it?
Well, I don't think we should give up hope. The first step, as always, is awareness. The more people understand how this stuff works.
The more they can question the narratives they're being fed.
Exactly. It's like shining a light into the darkness. Transparency is crucial.
So knowledge is power. Educate ourselves. Spread the word.
Absolutely. We need to start asking some tough questions like, who are these central bankers? Who do they answer to? Whose interests are they really serving? And we need to demand more transparency, more accountability.
Right? Why should they get to operate in secret when their decisions affect all of us so profoundly?
Exactly. It's like they have so much power, but who gave it to them and who are they using it to help?
It sounds like we need a system overhaul, a fundamental shift in how we think about economics.
Maybe the documentary does a great job of highlighting the problems, but they don't really offer any concrete solutions.
So what can the average person do besides, educating themselves and demanding transparency? Any practical tips for navigating this system?
Well, for starters, be mindful of where your money goes. The documentary makes you think twice about just blindly trusting big banks.
So explore alternatives.
Yeah, maybe look into local businesses, community initiatives, even alternative currencies. Diversify your options.
Control your finances. Don't just passively go with the flow.
Exactly. Empower yourself. Support systems that align with your values.
Right, and remember, this documentary is just one perspective. There are other voices out there, folks working on different economic models that could be more just, more equitable.
Definitely worth exploring those ideas.
So if we're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, a bit disillusioned, where do we go from here? What's the most important message for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that we're not helpless. Change starts with awareness, with questioning, with challenging the way things are.
We have to be active participants, not just passive bystanders.
Exactly. We have more power than we think. And who knows, maybe by having these conversations, by raising awareness, by demanding better, we can actually create a fairer economic system for everyone.
I love that. A note of hope. So before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore those alternative economic models you mentioned and take a closer look at the Eurozone crisis, let's give our listener a moment to digest all this.
Yeah, take a walk, grab a coffee, let it all sink in.
And we're back, learners. We've dug into Japan's economic miracle, the Asian financial crisis, and now we're shifting gears to Europe.
Europe, specifically the Eurozone crisis, Buckle up because this is where things get really interesting.
All right, hit me with it. What went down in the Eurozone? I vaguely remember something about Greece and bailouts, but it all seemed pretty complicated.
Oh, it was definitely a messy situation. The whole thing kicked off back in 2009 with Greece.
Greece, okay.
They had borrowed a ton of money in euros, but then the global financial crisis hit. Their economy went into a tailspin, and they couldn't pay back their debts.
Uh-oh, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was, and it triggered a chain reaction. Other countries like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, they started having similar problems. It was a domino effect.
So what happened? Did the European Central Bank, the ECB, step in to save the day?
Kind of. The ECB teamed up with the European Commission and the IMF to form this group they called the Troika.
The Troika.
They basically became the lender of last resort for these struggling countries, but their help came with a lot of strings attached.
There's always a catch, right? What kind of strings are we talking about?
They imposed these super harsh austerity measures on those countries in exchange for financial assistance.
Austerity measures like what?
Think slashing government spending, raising taxes, cutting back on social programs, all that fun stuff.
Ouch, that doesn't sound fun at all. Especially during a crisis. Wouldn't that just make things worse? Like kicking someone when they're already down?
It does seem counterintuitive, right? And that's exactly what the documentary argues. They say these austerity measures totally backfired, made the recession even worse, and caused a ton of suffering for ordinary people.
So the cure was worse than the disease.
That's the argument. They say by cutting spending and raising taxes during a recession, you're essentially taking money out of the economy when it needs it most.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Pretty much. And the documentary claims the ECB knew this was going to happen.
They knew. So if they knew it was going to make things worse, why do it?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The documentary suggests that the ECB's real goal wasn't to help those countries recover.
Okay, here we go again. Another hidden agenda. What were they after this time?
They claim the ECB wanted to use the crisis to push for a more centralized and integrated European economy.
So more power for the European Union, less for individual countries.
Exactly. It was about consolidating control and advancing their own vision for Europe, even if it meant hurting people along the way.
This is starting to feel like a broken record. Every time there's a crisis, the little guy gets screwed.
It's a recurring theme, unfortunately, but hey, at least we're becoming aware of it. That's the first step.
Knowledge is power, right?
Right.
But what good is knowledge if we can't do anything about it? Are there any alternatives to this system? Any glimmer of hope?
I think there's always hope. Remember, this documentary is just one perspective, and there are a lot of smart people out there working on different models, trying to build a better system.
Like what? Give me some examples. What kind of alternatives are out there?
Well, one idea that's gaining some traction is this concept of sovereign money creation.
Sovereign money creation. That sounds intense. Break it down for me.
Basically, it means giving governments, not central banks, the power to create money.
Wait, so instead of borrowing money or relying on the central bank, the government could just print its own money?
That's the gist of it. And the idea is that governments could then spend that money directly into the economy, on things like infrastructure, social programs, green energy, whatever they need.
So instead of the money going to banks and financial institutions, it goes directly to the people.
Yeah, and those who support this idea say it would reduce government debt, stimulate the economy, and give governments more control over their own finances.
It sounds promising, but I imagine there would be a lot of pushback from, the powers that be, the folks who benefit from the current system.
Oh, there definitely would be. Change is never easy, especially when it threatens the status quo.
True, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right?
Exactly. We have to keep pushing for a better world, even if it's an uphill battle.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of central banking, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do you want them to remember?
I want them to remember that they have power, they have a voice. Don't just accept the way things are, question everything, do your own research, and speak up, demand better.
It's about being engaged, being informed, being active participants in shaping our future.
Exactly. And if this documentary has sparked your curiosity, if it's made you think differently about the world, that's a good thing. Keep learning, keep exploring, keep asking questions.
Because who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the solution, the idea that changes everything.
Never underestimate the power of an informed and engaged citizen.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this wild ride. We've covered a lot of ground, but this is just the beginning of the conversation.
There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn.
And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What resonated with you? What questions do you still have? Share your insights with us on social media, on our website, wherever you hang out online.
Let's keep this conversation going because together we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, learners.